Welcome to Living Outside the Matrix, the philosophy show where we explode the many modern myths of our culture and examine important issues that can affect our lifestyle choices. Hi there, my name's Nigel Howitt, and on the show today it's a great pleasure to be joined by Dr. Stephanie Seneff from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Dr. Seneff is a senior research scientist at the Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory, but in recent years she has been more focused on research back in towards biology. She's concentrating mainly on the relationship between nutrition and health, and she's published I think over 24 papers since 2011. So Dr. Stephanie Seneff, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, and a warm welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Great. So today, really, the issue is glyphosate, this ubiquitous chemical that more and more people are becoming aware of. It has very grave toxic implications. Dr. Seneff, could you maybe start us off by giving us a broad, an outline of glyphosate, what it is, and so forth? And I'll
yes.
pick your brain as we go.
Okay, well, we can start at the top. Glyphosate is an herbicide. It's the herbicide, the active ingredient in Roundup, and people usually know the word Roundup, which is people use it on the dandelions in their yards, and it's all over the food supply. It's a very popular herbicide because it's considered to be essentially non-toxic to humans. We don't have the biological pathway that it disrupts in the plants, and then it's perfect, no problem. However, it's extremely toxic to plants. It kills all plants except for those that have been engineered with a special bacterial gene to protect them. Something that kills all plants, it's suspicious to say that it is harmless to humans. And I became aware of its harmfulness because of a fortuitous event when I happened to be in a conference where Professor Don Huber was giving a talk on glyphosate. And I have to admit, at that point, I didn't know what glyphosate was. And I think a lot of people don't know what glyphosate is. Now it's like so much in my brain that I can't imagine someone not knowing that word. But of course, I didn't either, just, maybe 6 years ago. He gave this talk and I was like, oh, my God, this is it, because I'd been looking for the reason for the autism epidemic, which I'm very, very concerned about.
Right. And, yeah. I'm keen to maybe get into autism. That is fascinating. But maybe you can elaborate. Monsanto claimed that glyphosate is harmless because it doesn't affect this pathway that humans have. But is it true that it kills all bacteria and, in fact, single-celled microbes on contact? Is it that powerful?
Well, it is a very good antimicrobial agent. It's been patented as such. And what's really scary is that the microbes that are especially sensitive are the ones that are really, really important in the gut. One thing I'm really becoming aware of more recently, is Bifidobacteria. Bifidobacteria are super, super important in the infant gut. In fact, in the old days, they were really dominant, almost the only species. They really took over the gut. They're very good at metabolizing milk and those complex milk glycoproteins, which is really, really important because then that becomes nutrients for the human host. Bifidobacteria are the most severely affected. In a study on poultry microbiota, the authors found that it was the most sensitive. And we're seeing that. It's fascinating. I'm looking at data on, for example, type 1 diabetes in Finland versus Russia just across the way. Very, very different. They have an epidemic in Finland and they don't in Russia. And in Finland, the infants have a much reduced bifidobacteria, whereas the Russian infants are mostly bifidobacteria. In other words, the difference, I think, is that Finland is getting much more exposed to glyphosate than Russia is. That would be my working hypothesis.
Yeah, could you just differentiate type 1 diabetes, of course, being the kind that usually infants are born with, type 2 being the kind that we develop, arguably through incorrect diet. So can you elaborate a bit more on type 1 diabetes? I was unaware until actually a cousin of mine developed it. I was unaware that an adult could even have type 1 diabetes. Can you explain how that arises?
That's fascinating, absolutely fascinating. And I had the same impression. I had the impression that it was a genetic disease. And then when I saw that it was going up, I was like, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. Why would a genetic disease go up? And it's becoming an epidemic in the Western world. And I was fascinated by that. And I've really come to be aware that I think the key thing that what glyphosate is doing to us is, first of all, it's causing our digestive system to be impaired, that it can't break down proteins, particularly things like gluten and lactose in milk. So the milk proteins, not just the lactose, but the casein, so complex proteins in milk and in wheat. that require special enzymes that aren't working because of the glyphosate. And then furthermore, the glyphosate sets up a leaky gut barrier because it creates an inflammatory gut because it's part of knocking out those beneficial bacteria. So the pathogens get a chance to overgrow. The immune cells get on fire. They release inflammatory agents. They erode the gut lining. And I think also because the baby can't digest the milk, it can't use the milk to help make the gut lining safe.
Right.
So the gut gets leaky. The proteins don't get digested. The leaky proteins get out into the general circulation, go into the lymph system, actually. And the pancreas is very sensitive to autoimmune disease through molecular mimicry. So what's happening, I think, is we're getting all these proteins, not just the food proteins, but also the viruses, the bacteria, all these proteins that are getting into the lymph system and causing the immune cells to get upset. And they develop antibodies to those proteins, which become autoantibodies to the pancreatic beta cells. They actually destroy the beta cells through the immune cells are attacking the pancreas because of this molecular mimicry problem. And I actually think glyphosate disrupts the immune cells as well. I think it disrupts their ability to perfect their antibodies. So the antibodies get kind of like they have poor vision, they can't see well, and they mistake human proteins for the foreign proteins and attack the wrong thing, basically, and destroy the pancreas.
Yeah, I'm keen to sort of take a closer look at exactly how glyphosate does compromise the gut. Through, well, obviously you've mentioned that it destroys some of the bacteria. It's going to affect the species profile within the gut, but also the mechanism by which it breaks down the gut lining. But first, maybe I should just mention for the listeners' sake that glyphosate is really in all our food. You mentioned it's a very, very popular herbicide, and it's even used as a desiccant on wheat to dry wheat out. So wheat is particularly problematic. You already mentioned the gluten, and then I believe there's a synergistic effect with glyphosate sprayed on wheat. So unless it's organic. So glyphosate, I suppose the takeaway message is there that it's very much in almost all our food, obviously less if we're eating organic.
Right, yes, and especially certain surprising foods like legumes. I was surprised by this, but Canada did a big study, and they found the highest levels in chickpeas and garbanzo beans, things like hummus, which I wouldn't have expected, but they're being sprayed right before the harvest as well, and it's really getting into the seed there and causing, I think, a lot of problems.
Do you think it's fair to say, given that glyphosate is a water-soluble toxin, so it's not sort of sequestered in fats at all, is it fair to say that it's probably everywhere, all around the planet? I mean, if not all around the planet, certainly all over the United States. It's probably very widely used here in the UK. I don't know much about the details of Europe. So is it literally in the wind and the rain and the water?
It absolutely is. I mean, they've done studies. In Kentucky, they studied the rain. I think they found it in 76% of the rainwater samples in Kentucky. And it's in the waterways. I think it's a major factor in I don't know, you probably don't know about Florida having a lot of trouble with blue-green algae and red tide. They had a lot of issues in Florida, very prestigious homes on the coast with this sea that's just so sick, if your dog swims in the water, he dies type of thing. I mean, it's really incredible. They're getting all this red tide, blue-green algae overgrowth, which I think is glyphosate's a major contributor. And partly that's because they have these sugarcane plantations around this lake, and it's the water. The glyphosate is just pouring into the ocean there. It's very sad, but I can give many, many examples in nature. I think the bees. I think glyphosate is a major factor in bee colony collapse syndrome. I think it's a major factor in the monarch butterfly, which is disappearing. I mean, we're seeing all these species dying off. And in the deer, we have a problem with a prion disease like mad cow in the United States. Nobody understands what it is. I think it's directly due to glyphosate. And I am figuring out how glyphosate causes all these really bizarre diseases. It's really, really fascinating. And I think it has to do with the fact that it's a glycine molecule. It's a complete glycine with extra stuff stuck onto its nitrogen atom. This is what makes it so toxic, and it's insidious and cumulative.
Before we dive into that glycine issue, because I'm fascinated by that, maybe we could just elaborate as to how it really gets into the system. And I'm understanding that it's primarily the damage it does to the gut, the leaky gut, and then obviously it can go systemic along with other things. Can you give us a little bit of a clarity on how leaky gut is caused by glyphosate?
Yeah, and of course, in part, that's because of killing off the beneficial bacteria, because that then gives the pathogens an opportunity to grow. And when the pathogens are overproducing, then you get the immune cells coming in to kill them, and the immune cells are releasing all these cytokines, things that will damage the gut lining. I think there's also an issue with sulfur. I'm identifying more and more an issue with sulfur, that it's disrupting the enzymes that manage sulfur. And what happens is you get an overgrowth of sulfur-reducing bacteria in the gut, like D-sulfovibrio and Bilophilo-Wadsworthia. These are microbes that reduce sulfur, inorganic sulfur, to hydrogen sulfide gas. And the hydrogen sulfide gas erodes the gut barrier. Right. So that's one way. And then you also get the release of zonulin, which causes the cells in the midgut to open up barriers. There's like a response that happens because of the release of zonulin, because of the undigested proteins. It's disrupting the digestive system, the digestive proteins that are released by the enzymes that are released by the pancreas. Trypsin, pepsin, and lipase, these are important enzymes to digest proteins and fats. And Anthony Samso ordered samples of these from a lab, a version from a pig. And he found high levels of glyphosate in all three of them, trypsin, pepsin, and lipase. We've reported on that in one of our papers. So it's getting into those proteins. I think it's actually substituting for glycine in those proteins, disrupting their ability to do their job, which is then causing the proteins not to get digested. And once there are undigested proteins, the gut gets upset with that situation. It opens up the barrier, it does all kinds of reactions that cause trouble, that cause then bad things to get into the lymph system, and then the immune cells go on fire in the lymph system. They start building these antibodies that are going to cause autoimmune disease. And this is not just diabetes; it's all kinds of autoimmune diseases that we're seeing an epidemic in today, rheumatoid arthritis and lupus and all these things.
Yeah, is it true that the zonulin, which I believe is involved in the mechanism, as you alluded to there, of opening up the tight junctions that hold the gut lining together?
Yes, that's right.
I believe that can go systemic and affect the blood-brain barrier. And does this tie in with autism and things?
Absolutely. I mean, I think glyphosate is opening up all the barriers, the placental barrier as well, which is going to allow it to get into the fetus. And so all those barriers are being opened up as a consequence of the glyphosate. And then not just glyphosate is getting in, but all kinds of other things. In fact, undigested peptides are getting into the brain, and then the brain's immune system is reacting, and then you're getting autoimmune attack on the nerve cells. Things like myelin basic protein can get attacked by autoimmune antibodies that are derived from a reaction to undigested proteins that got into the brain. So everything is getting in all these wrong places and causing a whole bunch of trouble.
Gosh, yeah, it sounds like a complete disaster, doesn't it? So let's pick up the thread again with glycine, because glycine, correct me, I'm not sure whether it's one of the essential amino acids or not, i.e. one that the human body can't make. But perhaps you can explain a little bit about how glyphosate is so similar, and it can sort of switch places and become used instead of a glycine, a bit of glycine. Can you explain that?
Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, it was such an insight when Anthony suggested that to me, and I had rejected it originally because I thought because of something attached to the nitrogen, it would prevent it from getting into the protein chain. And then I realized that wasn't true, because proline is a coding amino acid that also has carbon attached to the nitrogen. So it's a proof proof that it can happen, and therefore I don't see that as a barrier. I think in certain proteins it won't be able to fit because it's got that extra piece. It won't fit if the neighbors are big. But in a situation where there's a glycine and its neighboring residues are small, there's room for that extra methylphosphonyl group. And then the mechanism of connecting it works beautifully because it matches perfectly into the glycine slot of the protein that's involved with placing the amino acids in place. This is all about the DNA code. When you see a code for glycine, you have a protein that actually has a pocket where glycine fits beautifully. And glyphosate fits beautifully in that pocket too, because the nitrogen has to be outside the pocket in order to be able to hook up to the neighbor in the chain. So it works great for glyphosate, I think, to substitute for glycine. In cases where the protein doesn't have big amino acids nearby, glyphosate can substitute, and then it messes up the protein big time. Glycine is the smallest amino acid. It has no side chains. It's very clean. And of course, the key for glycine has to be that it perfectly snugly fits that molecule, so it excludes all other amino acids. But glyphosate matches beautifully because it also has no side chains. Right.
And I mean, how widely used in the body is glycine as a basic amino acid?
It's huge. It's everywhere. I mean, it's in most proteins, and some proteins have lots of it. Collagen has every there's long segments of collagen that has a GXY sequence where every third amino acid is a glycine. That's crucial for it to be able to fold in this beautiful triple helix structure that gives its tensile strength and its ability to hold water and its flexibility. I mean, all the beautiful things about collagen. Collagen, the most common protein in the body, with huge amounts of glycine in it, tremendous opportunity for substitution, which can cause all kinds of damage at joints and bones and all this kind of, pain that we're seeing, all this back pain and knee joint, all this. We have huge issues with people getting in trouble with their joints and their bones and taking opioid drugs to try to cope with the pain and dying of opioid drug overdose. I mean, all of this is happening in our country. I think glyphosate's a major player. Yeah. So glycine is, in fact, the body can make it. It's not like some of the others. I didn't mention the aromatic amino acids, but one of the things that glyphosate does in this pathway that it disrupts, that pathway produces the aromatic amino acids. There are 3 of them, and they are essential. Our cells can't make those. That's what you were referring to, essential versus not essential. Glycine's not essential. We can make it, but we can't make those 3, and glyphosate disrupts the enzyme in the bacteria and in the plants that makes those aromatic amino acids, and those are super, super important biologically. That's another issue.
Yeah, I believe one of them is tryptophan, isn't it? It's
yes.
Tryptophan and tyrosine and another one. Tryptophan, phenylalanine. Most people, or some people might recall that tryptophan is involved with making melatonin, I think, and serotonin. So does this mean that glyphosate could be implicated in the epidemic of depression? Could it? There's obviously
I absolutely think so. Absolutely, yes. A serotonin deficiency. It's also linked to violent behavior, which of course we also have a problem with in the United States. We have all these school shootouts where crazy people go in and kill children in the classroom. This is happening so many. I mean, it's amazing how many times this is happening in our country. It's just beyond what you would expect a human to do. Behavior that is extraordinary, and I think it's the severe serotonin deficiency that's driving both that and the depression, violent behavior and depression.
Absolutely. I mean, one often hears when somebody's trumpeting a cause that this cause, this thing is responsible for everything, but it really does seem like glyphosate is such it does so much damage in so many areas. Insidiously, because Monsanto claimed that it's perfectly safe because it doesn't directly affect humans. But so how is it implicated with things like autism and of course other diseases? Maybe you give us a snapshot as well as a little look into autism, a sort of an idea of how wide the spectrum of chronic disease is that it's likely that glyphosate is implicit in.
Yes, I think it is absolutely autism. I feel like it's by far the most important factor in the autism epidemic. When you look at the curves, they match perfectly. If you look at glyphosate usage on corn and soy crops over the previous 4 years compared to autism rates in first grade in the United States, those 2 curves coincide with like a 0.98 correlation coefficient. It's absolutely perfect match, which is really interesting. And of course, people say, oh, correlation doesn't mean causation. I'm shocked that people can just dismiss that in one sentence and say it doesn't mean causation, forget it.
It's a red flag, isn't it?
You see all these diseases that are going up. Alzheimer's is the same. It matches really well. Diabetes matches really well. So does obesity. I mean, all these things are going up dramatically, exactly in step with a dramatic rise in glyphosate. And there's nothing else among chemicals used in agriculture that matches anywhere near as well. I've looked at lots of things, and glyphosate is the only one that matches. And it does, you sort of say, how can one chemical be so bad? This is how, I think, because it's a chelator as well. It has a negative charge. It binds to these metals and messes up all the minerals. So you've got all kinds of mineral deficiencies and mineral toxicities at the same time because of glyphosate. It binds to the minerals, takes them someplace else, and in the acidic environment, it drops them off. It can make things toxic at the same time as they're deficient in terms of minerals.
So it's messing up with mineral distribution effectively, because it has this property of a chelator of grabbing hold of things and being reluctant to let go of them. Is it also causing fundamental nutritional deficiencies as well as this disruption of distribution?
Yes, and I think it's messing up the absorption of cobalamin, vitamin B12. So I think you end up with a vitamin B12 deficiency, which can lead to brain disorders. It can lead to dementia, for example, with cobalamin deficiency. And I think that's connected to autism as well. It disrupts the absorption of B12. And the whole process of B12 is very, very difficult to get to manage, because it's a big bulky molecule and has to be protected from digestion. I mean, they have all these fancy things that go on, but they get messed up by glyphosate. And so you get, you get B12 deficiency, you get mineral deficiency, mineral toxicity. And then, of course, you get all these proteins being messed up. I mean, for example, myosin is a good example. I believe that glyphosate is getting into the myosin protein in place of glycine and disrupting its ability to work. And myosin is a muscle contractile protein. And in the gut, myosin is very important for pushing the feces through the digestive system, contracting and moving, the contents of the digestive system. Autistic kids have tremendous issues with digestion, and they end up with a combination of both diarrhea and constipation. They basically they stack up everything. They can't go, and it all stacks up until it finally their belly gets big, and then they finally you get a bunch of water rushing in and they explode, and they have this massive diarrhea. Cycles of constipation and diarrhea. And what's happening, I think, is that the myosin is being poisoned by the glyphosate. The glyphosate is getting in place of glycine and disabling the myosin protein to be able to contract. And it's been shown in studies, even if you take, there's at least 2 glycines, there's actually 11 glycines in myosin. They're absolutely conserved against across all kinds of different species versions of myosin. So glycine is really, really important in myosin. And there are at least 2 of them that when you substitute something else, even something as small as alanine, which is just one extra methyl group, the protein is dead in the water. It goes down to only 1% of its ability to contract. So once you start sprinkling glyphosate throughout the myosin molecule, you're going to totally mess up the peristalsis in the gut, and you're going to cause this issue that you see in autism with this paralytic gut and this inability to, and of course then you get this backed up feces, which causes SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, which is also a characteristic of autism. So the gut is just getting completely messed up. In so many ways.
It's almost it's almost incredible that there isn't more disease and when you start to dive into what this molecule of glyphosate is doing, it seems miraculous that the results aren't even worse than they are. Which
it will be, by the way. I think it's cumulative, and in fact, I'm seeing sort of 3rd generation effects, 2nd generation effects. There's a study on rats, I think it was, where they exposed the rat dam to small amounts of glyphosate over the course of her pregnancy and during lactation. And then the pups were monitored, and then the pups were monitored. They took it through 2 generations. The rat dam was exposed to so little glyphosate that she was not affected at all. They couldn't see anything wrong with her. And the offspring looked okay too. They seemed fine. They grew up. You started to see trouble in that next generation. So it was actually the germline that was being exposed in utero, because the female rat or the female mammal makes all of its eggs early in the pregnancy. It's quite interesting, and those eggs are susceptible to damage in utero. And those eggs got so damaged that they had, first of all, there was premature. The pups were small. There were fewer in the litter. There were placental problems, inflammation in the placenta, and there were 3 cases of extremely unusual deformities that occurred among the offspring of 3 different lines of rats exposed to glyphosate in that 1st generation. So it's a 2nd generation effect that you're seeing when the grandmother is exposed. It's quite amazing to me. We're going to see that in humans as well. We're starting to get into that next generation, and we're going to see, huge problems with infertility and genetic defects in the offspring of the generation that's growing up right now. I predict this is going to happen. Yeah,
it's, I think, a very under-recognized phenomenon, isn't this? The inheritance, the fact that over the generations, the cumulative effect of glyphosate we're talking about specifically here, but other health challenges as well, having this effect compounded across the generations. Dr. Seneff, can we just return just briefly to type 1 diabetes? Can you, just out of interest, how does glyphosate, how is it implicit in type 1 diabetes?
Well, I think it's because of the lack of an ability to digest the proteins. Right. And then you get undigested peptides that, for example, gluten peptides, that then get into, and the immune cells react to those and develop antibodies. And then through this process of molecular mimicry, where the beta cells have proteins that they express that have similar peptide sequences to the peptide sequence that's in the gluten. And then the immune cells get confused and they start attacking the beta cells. Because they think they're foreign now, because they've learned it from the gluten that didn't get digested. And then they destroy the beta cells, and the beta cells can't release insulin anymore.
My goodness. Yes, it's it's quite amazing, isn't it? It's across the board spectrum. This molecule of glyphosate, it's a real bad guy. Can you tell us a little bit about mitochondrial health? And is there, are there any sort of direct mechanisms where we can, I believe the World Health Organization dubbed glyphosate, or rather admitted, possibly under pressure, that glyphosate was a mitochondrial toxin. Can you, you have got anything to shed any light on that?
Yes, it is. In fact, it's been shown that it disrupts DNA. Of course, mitochondria have DNA inside them. They have their own private stash of DNA. And that DNA is going to be very susceptible to glyphosate exposure, being outside the nucleus. Many studies have shown that glyphosate is disrupting the DNA, causing DNA changes that are that are damaging the DNA. It causes oxidative stress and so the mitochondria, I actually think what it's doing, and this hasn't been proven, but I've looked at proteins within the mitochondria that have, for example, the cytochrome C oxidase. Is a protein very important in the mitochondria, and it has, again, glycine sensitivities that if you substitute glyphosate for glycine at a spot where superoxide binds, it'll disrupt that binding. So it'll cause the superoxide to get released rather than being used to make the water. It's supposed to turn oxygen into water, basically, in the process of digesting the food. And that process gets disrupted, so the mitochondria end up releasing superoxide, which is a very toxic reactive oxygen species that's going to cause damage. That's going to give you your DNA damage and all kinds of other damage to the fats in the membranes, all kinds of trouble. Yeah. So they've definitely seen mitochondrial damage in association with glyphosate and also with Roundup in particular. Roundup has additional toxins in it. The surfactants that are added actually enable glyphosate to get into the cell more easily and also to get into mitochondria more easily. So the surfactants make the glyphosate much more toxic than it would otherwise be in the Roundup formulation. So
just in case any listeners don't know, what is a surfactant?
Yeah, so that's the things they add. So actually it's interesting because glyphosate is what they study. When Monsanto said this stuff is safe, they studied pure glyphosate and saw its effects. When they made the formulations, they added other stuff to it. And of course, that other stuff was added to make the glyphosate more toxic to the plant, so it would work better as a weed killer. And I think it's two things. One is that the surfactants are things that will actually disrupt the cell membrane. Right. And break it apart. So that allows glyphosate easier entry into the cell because of that. But also the surfactants are disrupting the cell in other ways as well, obviously, if they're messing up the cell membrane, not just the glyphosate, but they have their own independent toxic effect, which is very acute and immediate, whereas glyphosate's effects are more insidious and cumulative. Because once it goes, I think it just accumulates. In fact, it accumulates. Anthony Samsel has looked. He has a bunch of Monsanto data, and he's seen that they found that it has the highest levels of concentration over the body. When they've looked, the bones end up with the highest levels of glyphosate, and the bone marrow in particular has glyphosate in it. So I think it's because the bone marrow depends a lot on glycine. Any cell that builds proteins that have glycine in them, have a lot of glycine in them, is going to be impacted by glyphosate more than other cells because they actively take the glyphosate up along amino acid channels. Right. So when you are a cell that makes protein, you're going to take up lots of glyphosate, actively take it up. But it can also go through the membrane passively, and actually that works better under acidic environments, which is why I believe the stomach gets hit hard, because a paper showed that glyphosate passively will go through membranes much, much better if you're low pH, if you're acid, like stomach acid. Mm-hmm. And so the stomach cells are going to be more sensitive, much more sensitive to glyphosate than other cells.
Right. Is there evidence that the specific stomach problems, can you, I don't know of any specific stomach problems, but what sort of conditions are we talking about there?
I'm guessing
does it tie in with the acid? Sorry to speak over you there. Is it acid reflux and things like that?
Yeah. Acid reflux, absolutely. And acid reflux, I think, is a combination of is maybe due in part to the pyloric valve getting disrupted by glyphosate, because that's got a lot of collagen, which is going to get glyphosate substitution for the glycine and the collagen, which is going to cause it to not behave properly. So any kind of valve, and like heart valves are getting in trouble as well. We have a lot of people with heart valve issues and pyloric valve. So you get this acid reflux because it's not tightly keeping the acid from getting out of the stomach. But you also have insufficient acid in the stomach. In fact, the entire gut has a higher pH. People are finding that the pH of the gut is going up over time. And I think that's because these parietal cells the parietal cells produce the hydrogen chloride that keeps the gut acid. And the parietal cells are going to get hit hard by glyphosate because of this acidic environment. So they they get hit by glyphosate, they get disrupted, and they also produce an intrinsic factor, which is essential for cobalamin absorption. So they can't make the intrinsic factor, and they can't make enough of the acid. So the stomach is not acid enough, and then that means, of course, the proteins won't get digested, because you need the hydrogen chloride is very good at breaking down the proteins. You need to break down the proteins that you eat into individual amino acids, and the hydrochloric acid does a good job at getting that started.
Right.
But if you can't produce enough of it, it doesn't work as well. And now you've got this continues with the problem with the trypsin and pepsin as well.
Right. So is the pyloric valve, is that the one at the top of the stomach, or is that the one at the bottom when it goes into the small intestine?
I hope I got that right. I'm a little worried that I might have said the wrong one. The valve at the top is the one I mean, and I might have said the wrong one.
Okay, no worries.
I'm not sure.
So as you mentioned,
at the bottom of the esophagus.
Yeah, so at the bottom of the esophagus. So I mean, some people might wonder how this glycine is being replaced by the glyphosate. I don't know what the turnaround time is for cells of a valve like that. I mean, I've heard that the gut lining turns around roughly once every 3 days.
Right.
But I suppose it's as the tissue, the cells that make up the tissue of the valve die off and are being replaced. There's an increasing density of the misplaced glyphosate molecule instead of glycine. And this is resulting in the valve literally not working correctly and
exactly.
Right.
That's what I think. This is theory. That's theory. It hasn't been proven, but that's what I suspect is going on. Certainly, acid reflux is an epidemic. And people are taking Nexium. They're taking Nexium for life. Yes. Many people, I think, because of acid reflux problems.
Shocking.
Just another one of the conditions that we're coping with these days.
Yes, it's shocking. I was just very surprised to hear that the World Health Organization's definition of health as complete well-being is now deemed to be not appropriate, and they wanted to water it down to coping with environmental and emotional stresses or something, or an ability to adapt, something like that. Anyway, a shocking aside there. But just to come back to the mitochondria, obviously there's an epidemic of chronic fatigue and all of these other literal lack of energy associated conditions. Do you think that there's a good evidence, or are we just sort of lumping it in? Is there any specific evidence to tie that in? Is mitochondrial biogenesis, the triggering of more mitochondria, is that all inhibited with these processes?
Yeah, well, what I think happens is the mitochondria don't work efficiently, and they end up spewing out superoxide and causing damage to themselves. And then, of course, they work worse once they start damaging themselves. Yeah. It's very interesting because I've identified particular sites in proteins that are likely to be extremely sensitive to glyphosate substitution, which are places where phosphate binds. And the mitochondria depend upon phosphate binding of ATP, to do their whole thing. And that those enzymes that depend upon the phosphate of the ATP binding to the protein are very susceptible to glyphosate damage. That's the same thing, by the way, with the enzyme. I learned this from the PEP, the enzyme that is disrupted in the shikimate pathway, that everybody says that's the reason why glyphosate kills the plants. That enzyme is called EPSP synthase, and it has this substrate called phosphoenol pyruvate, PEP. And it's at the PEP binding site, and it's at the phosphate of the PEP binding site that glyphosate disrupts it. That's well established. There's no argument about that. Okay. And it's interesting because that particular protein has a glycine residue, highly conserved, at the site where phosphate binds. And the researchers, all the Monsanto researchers and all the researchers know that if you get rid of that glycine and replace it in the code with alanine, then the protein is completely impervious to any kind of glyphosate damage. In other words, that completely cures its sensitivity to glyphosate by getting rid of that glycine at that spot where phosphate binds. Okay. And so what's happening is that the phosphate binding site has to set up a hole where phosphate can fit. And so it typically has glycine there. Almost every phosphate binding protein has at least one glycine, sometimes 3, at the site where phosphate binds. Tremendous opportunity for glyphosate substitution because the whole protein is designed to attract the phosphate to go into that site. It's got other amino acids that have positive charge, are going to anchor that phosphate in place. They're perfect for anchoring glyphosate's methylphosphonyl group in place. It's a very good phosphate substitute. So that glyphosate is very eager to go into that spot in that protein during protein synthesis is what I suspect. So any protein that binds ATP, GTP, NADPH, there's all these really interesting small biological molecules that have phosphate in them. And where the protein binds the phosphate is extremely sensitive to glyphosate disruption, I suspect. And that's what I've been looking at, and it correlates with the diseases. So it's really quite exciting to sort of piece all the puzzle pieces together. But it makes a lot of sense.
Absolutely, and just to reiterate the correlation factor, as you said, it doesn't directly indicate causation, but if you get a lot of correlation, it does. It's like all sort of signs all pointing in the same direction. It is evidence that really needs to be taken into consideration, isn't it?
Yeah, and especially because if you say if it's not glyphosate, what is it? Because all these diseases are going up dramatically. Something's causing it. Yeah. And it shocks me that people don't seem to think that's a problem, that diabetes is going up exponentially and autism is going up exponentially. People don't seem to think that's a problem, and to say something is causing it, and glyphosate happens to be also going up exponentially exactly in step. And I can't find very few other things that can match. There's been a great increase in the number of vaccines kids are getting. There's certainly EMFs as a possibility. Yeah. We've considered fluoride as being a contributor. In the U.S., we put fluoride in our water supply. I think it's a bad idea, and I think it's working synergistically. Aluminum, there are these other toxins that are contributing. And glyphosate is working synergistically with most of them. The mercury, the aluminum, the fluoride, they're all working the lead, we have lead issues. In fact, glyphosate will strip the lead off of pipes. And I suspect that the issues we're having with excess lead in our water is partially contributed by glyphosate in the water, stripping the lead off the lead pipe.
And then does you mentioned earlier that an acidic environment can encourage the glyphosate to let go. Does that mean it'll get deposited in the stomach?
Exactly so. That's what I'm thinking. The first acidic environment it's going to hit is the stomach, and it's going to let go of whatever metal it happens to be bound to at that point, and cause real trouble.
Shocking. So really a takeaway point for people here really is to begin to appreciate that this so widely used agricultural herbicide in Roundup, as you said, as a desiccant on wheat, it's in almost all of our food, it's in the air and the water and so forth, is a major problem. So I suppose public awareness and to campaign against its use is going to be at the top of the list of of priorities amongst other things. What about this idea that chlorine dioxide can remove it? Because I spoke with Dr. Zach Bush, and yes. he originally was saying things like, well, glyphosate is going to take about 50 years to break down in the environment, which of course is tremendously bad news. But I've heard heard it said that maybe chlorine dioxide can break it down. Can you tell us anything about that?
Yes, I've been finding papers that talk about breaking it down with chlorine dioxide and also with ozone. Ozone and chlorine dioxide break it down non-enzymatically, which is quite interesting. And I know that many people are finding that their health problems are improving with taking chlorine dioxide as a supplement, taking it in tiny amounts. So you have to be really, really careful with this stuff because it's extremely reactive. Anything that can break glyphosate down is extremely reactive because that CP bond is very, very sturdy. It's very difficult to break that CP bond. That is a really unusual bond that glyphosate has. That's what makes it so dangerous. And there are only a few microbes that can break it down. But one interesting one is Acidobacter, and I find that really curious. Acidobacter is among the few microbes that have this enzyme that breaks that CP bond. So they can actually break glyphosate apart and use it as a source of phosphorus for their own purposes. So I recommend that people take apple cider vinegar on a regular basis. Right. And you can just use it in a salad dressing. We use Bragg's organic apple cider vinegar as part of our salad dressing before dinner. So you've got this Acidobacter ready to go. You hope that it can break down the glyphosate before it gets into the stomach, even in the mouth. And people have had tremendous success with mouthwash with chlorine dioxide mouthwash to fix problems with the gums, because a lot of people have issues with their gums. They're getting destroyed by glyphosate as well. But the chlorine dioxide can really make a difference in infected, in tooth inflammation and that sort of. I think you used. Did you? Yeah.
I did. Yeah. We were scheduled to talk a few weeks ago, I had this. I had an infection under a tooth in my upper jaw, and I began a protocol of using chlorine dioxide. Some people might know it as MMS, I was taking, again, tiny minute quantities, something in the order of 3 drops on the hour every hour. I believe it breaks down. It breaks down in the body in about an hour's time, and it becomes just simple salt ions, I believe. So you take it every hour for 8 hours, and I was also slushing around with a slightly stronger solution in a glass of water with something called DMSO, dimethyl.
Oh yes, so that makes a good sense. Dimethyl sulfoxide. That's got sulfur. I mean, that's crucial.
That's
I
right.
actually think that chlorine dioxide reacts. I've got a really interesting story that I've worked out, and I published this actually, I think, before I even knew about glyphosate. I wrote a paper on this. It was so fascinating to me because taurine is a very interesting molecule. Taurine is a sulfur-containing amino acid, but it's not a coding amino acid. And taurine reacts with chlorine dioxide. It reacts with hypochlorite to produce something called taurine chloramine. And taurine is quite inert. Our body, our cells apparently don't know what to do with taurine. They just keep it. They don't do anything with it. They just keep it, and they store it in the brain, in the heart, in the liver. Large quantities of taurine are stored, and it's very interesting that taurine is released from the brain during encephalopathy, during seizures. You know, when you have a kind of a brain attack, the brain releases its stored taurine. The heart releases its stored taurine during a heart attack. Right. And it's very interesting to me. I think that stored taurine then makes it into the circulation, goes to the liver. The liver takes up the taurine. The liver puts taurine, attaches taurine to the bile acids. So, and this is done routinely. So taurine, the liver is constantly putting taurine back to the gut, attached to the bile acids. And I think this is a strategy to hand the taurine over to the microbes so they can turn it into sulfate. Okay. And I think you need the hypochlorite to do that. So basically there's a whole mechanism that takes place the body has figured out to deliver the taurine to the gut microbes, allowing them to convert that taurine into sulfate, and possibly requiring, or at least encouraging it to happen with hypochlorite as a catalyst. And so the hypochlorite is released by the immune cells in the gut, and I suspect they're impaired in their release and their ability to release hypochlorite with glyphosate, because glyphosate is disrupting the chlorine problem. The chlorine channel actually has a highly conserved glycine residue right at the squeeze point. And if that glycine is substituted by a bulky negatively charged amino acid, they've done experiments. If you substitute glutamate for that glycine, chloride can't get through at all. It's completely blocked. Right. So I'm suspecting glyphosate is substituting for the glycine in the chloride channel and preventing the parietal cells in the stomach from releasing chloride.
Right.
So really fascinating.
Yeah. So the DMSO, the dimethyl sulfoxide, I mixed the MMS with. I was slushing around with that, and I believe the mechanism. I'd heard that the DMSO is supposed to help drive the chlorine dioxide through the tooth. You know, that sounds fanciful to me, but maybe that's true. But anyway, my infection went away, and I was looking at it. I was looking at an extraction, so I'd strongly recommend that people consider that rather than taking a tooth out.
Yeah, and I've heard other people talk about that too, getting their gum disease cleared up with using small amounts of that combination. And DMSO is interesting, and there's also, of course, methylsulfonylmethane, which is a close cousin of DMSO, and I suspect that both of those are sulfur sources to produce sulfate, and I suspect that the chlorine dioxide enables that. So in other words, chlorine dioxide enables taurine to be turned into sulfate, and I suspect it also enables DMSO to be turned into sulfate. Right. Still speculative, but I believe that sulfate deficiency is a key driver behind all modern diseases, and I believe that glyphosate is a train wreck for sulfate. In fact, it was shown in a paper on E. coli that glyphosate tremendously suppressed a whole bunch of different taurine transporters in the E. coli. So it kept the E. coli from being able to take up the taurine, which was very, very interesting. Yes. And it makes me suspect that there's a defect in the ability to convert taurine to sulfate, which would make sense because sulfide oxidase has all kinds of sensitivities that I could cause. I could see how it would get busted by, including glycine residues, but also because it depends on a metal that glyphosate probably chelates, and it also has a heme, which is glyphosate disrupts the synthesis of heme. So there's many different ways in which sulfide oxidase would be disrupted. That's how you get the hydrogen sulfide gas, because you can't make sulfate. So you take the sulfur down into hydrogen sulfide gas, which is going to be toxic in excessive amounts.
Yeah. So I understand that chlorine dioxide is an oxidant. Basically, you put it in the same bundle as was it superoxide? No, I can't remember what you said.
Superoxide. Yeah,
superoxide. So how does it break down the glyphosate? Is it oxidizing it? Is that the mechanism? You mentioned it doesn't do it enzymatically.
Right, it's oxidizing it. Yeah, so it needs to oxidize in order to be able to break it apart into smaller pieces. That's how that works. And so, anything that is highly oxidizing is a very useful, by the way. So we have, inflammation, right? Inflammation is like behind all disease, modern disease. Inflammation induces the release of these reactive oxygen species and reactive nitrogen species. So, for example, peroxynitrite. Mm-hmm. But you've got the hypochlorite, the peroxynitrite, the superoxide. These things are all very reactive. Mm-hmm. And if you can control them, if you can have them work in a controlled, contained environment, they'll be okay. But because those controlled, contained environments are messed up, and that has to do with the structured water, which I've talked about in the past, but it's really, really fascinating.
Does it also mean that you need a topped-up reservoir of antioxidants? Obviously, a lot of people are familiar with the fact that, this is antioxidant, therefore it's good. There's probably a simplistic understanding of antioxidants out there in the general public. But is that why, if you use these oxidants, and given that MMS or chlorine dioxide is an oxidant, is it wise to only use it in short bursts? I mean, I suspected that maybe it would be problematic if you use it all the time. But if it does destroy glyphosate by oxidizing it, that obviously to me suggests that a periodic protocol of ingesting chlorine dioxide would be useful to, as well as apple cider vinegar, as you mentioned, would be useful to maybe remove or detoxify the body from glyphosate. Would you agree?
Yeah, it might be. I mean, if I were very sick, I think I probably would start taking it on a regular basis, every hour, small amounts on a regular basis, if I were very sick. As long as you can stay healthy, you don't want to do it because it is toxic. You have to be careful. But I think it's much less toxic than the glyphosate. So if you can get rid of the glyphosate that way, it's a win. In the end, it's a win. And as long as you're careful not to have too much, so that your system is able to remove it and detoxify it before it causes a lot of damage to your own tissues. I mean, the immune cells make hypochlorite, which is the same thing that this is making. They make it, and they obviously do it in an environment where it could cause damage there too. But it's not. People get upset about taking it. But the fact is, if your own cells are making it, it can't be that bad, right? It's sort of a natural thing in a way.
So just
to be very reactive.
Yeah. So just to be clear, then, our own cells don't make chlorine dioxide, but they make, what was it you just said?
Hypochlorite. Hypochlorite. Well, so chlorine dioxide breaks down into hypochlorite and other things. Of course, as you say, chloride. I mean, sodium chloride. We know that's fine, right? People think Clorox is very toxic, and people think of drinking bleach, and that they immediately have a very negative reaction to the idea of drinking bleach. I mean, in fact, they use chlorine dioxide in the water system to purify the water. At the purification plants for the water supply, they're using chlorine dioxide or something equivalent. Oxidizing with chlorine.
But it does break down, doesn't it? So it doesn't actually make it. It probably doesn't make it all the way to the tap, and then we're not actually ingesting any of the tap. Would you say it's
most of the time, I think that's true. I mean, some people probably you can almost smell the chlorine in your water, right? If you know. I mean, for example, in a swimming pool, you can know that there's chlorine in it. So it's not always broken down. But I think you're right. It turns into all these other things. The whole game is to get it at the precursor level, and then have it react into these things, and then have these things do their job and get in, get out. Get in and get out, basically.
Absolutely.
Because they react with other things, and then eventually it all turns into things that are fine, over time. But in the meantime, you could get some damage.
Yeah.
Collateral damage.
So what would you, from your perspective of your considerable knowledge about glyphosate, its impact, it's messing with the gut bacteria, it's messing with proteins, with all these peptides and so forth. It's usurping glycine and getting in there and disrupting it. It's causing problems everywhere. From your standpoint, what does one do? So somebody listening to this might think, "Oh my goodness, we could be accused of painting a gloomy picture here." What would you say in terms of avoidance and counteracting it? Obviously, we've just mentioned the use of chlorine dioxide.
And I mentioned also the Acidobacter. I really like the idea of and sauerkraut, all kinds of fermented foods like
fermented foods. Okay.
Kimchi and kombucha and sauerkraut, and even I think sour cream, and all these fermented foods are good to be eating on a regular basis.
How do they help? Can you explain the mechanism?
The Acidobacter.
Oh, okay.
Acidobacter can break glyphosate down. That's a huge way. But also you are just resupplying gut microbes, because your gut microbes are being killed all the time by glyphosate. So you need to keep replenishing them in a situation like that, because they're being killed. And you can do that in part through eating probiotic foods.
Right.
And,
Okay.
People have recommended fulvic acid and humic acid. Do you know about those?
I've heard of them.
Organic matter from the soil.
I've heard about them. Maybe you could explain this a little bit more about them for the listeners.
Yeah, they seem to be popular from what I gather. I've taken some myself. I'm not really noticed anything from it, but I'm pretty healthy, so maybe it would be hard to notice. They are organic matter, complex, molecules from the soil that are organic matter.
Yeah.
Fulvic acid, fulvic, not folic, but fulvic, Fulvic, and humic acid, and you can order those too online.
Yeah.
I think they're not toxic at all. They're binders, basically. Well, I think what is claimed is that they bind to the glyphosate and then remove it through the feces. So they don't break it down; they just bind it. Right. Which means, of course, it's still going to be in the environment. You're not getting rid of it. So I think the chlorine dioxide is better in the sense that it's actually breaking it down.
Yeah.
It's concerning to me that in certain soil types, glyphosate can live on for years. It depends on the soil type as to how long it will survive. And I think it's. I have to. Yeah. I want to say which kind of soil, but I'm not sure, so I won't say that.
Okay, no worries. I mean, when you mentioned just when going into soil type, I was wondering whether you were referring to the acidity of the soil versus the sort of sandy, clay, or more humus rich. But we can give that a swerve if you're not sure of the answer to that one.
Yeah, so it has to do with whether it's binding to things and sticking around because it's being bound and it's unable to. The microbes can't get at it because it's being bound. So it might be in the soils that have a lot of organic matter that the glyphosate's binding to the organic matter, and therefore the microbes are unable to metabolize it.
Yeah.
And of course, you could also just not have those microbes available that do metabolize it in the soil. That
would
be a problem.
Yeah, so I'm getting that obviously fermented foods, which are probably not in the average person's diet, although they're becoming more increasingly known, shall we say, they really are quite essential, aren't they? I know Natasha Campbell-McBride in Cambridge, she describes them as being not optional in the human diet, given the current context.
I agree with her.
Yes.
Yeah.
So a broader selection of fermented foods, would you say that's keeping an ongoing replenishment of crucial gut microbes to
yes.
Replace the ones that are being killed off?
That's the hope. And of course, when the microbes go through the stomach, they mostly get killed. So it's not that easy to replenish the microbiome through just eating more bacteria, because you really depend upon the ones there being healthy and being able to grow. Yeah. And they're constantly being killed by the glyphosate. So it's a huge problem, that hard to know how to address it. The other thing I recommend is sulfur-containing foods. I love garlic. I eat tons of it.
Right.
I think it's an excellent source of sulfur, and cruciferous vegetables, and seafood contains lots of sulfur, and grass-fed beef, I believe, is a good. Of course, you have to worry about whether the grass is actually organic or not.
Well, organic seems to be a no-brainer, doesn't it? In terms of if we're going to try and avoid glyphosate, I believe that organically certified, certainly here in the UK, it is by definition going to have less glyphosate in it, isn't it? I mean, if it's endemic in the environment, it's not going to have zero glyphosate, but that would seem to be a very sensible strategy for a lifestyle choice for people who are seeking
Absolutely, in fact. Yeah, we do. I mean, when we shop, we don't buy it if it's not organic. We always look for certified organic. If we can't find it certified organic, we don't eat it. At home, we still cheat when we go out to the restaurant because we don't have access to enough organic, offerings at restaurants. It's very, very rare. Unfortunately, I'm hoping that will come along, that people will start opening organic restaurants or organic choice on the menu, things like that. We need it. We need that. Absolutely. For those people who are trying to avoid glyphosate.
Yeah, I mean, I often, say to friends and people that you have to be careful with eating out, really, because whenever there are so few organic restaurants here in the UK. My favourite one's in Brighton, which is on the south coast, which is a good 2-hour drive from where I am, just north of London. And it's a great shame that there aren't more eating establishments. But then everybody wants cheap food, don't they? So cheap food. I mean, this is another thing where people sometimes feel helpless, but really it's consumer power that we can exercise, isn't it? Because it's the cheap food provided by all these herbicides and the convenience to farmers. With glyphosate as a desiccant. I mean, it's a dream ticket for northern latitude farmers that want to try and time their wheat harvest just before the weather turns and all this sort of thing. So it's very much consumer led, isn't it? And really, it is. People should really see that as empowering. We can choose what we buy, can't we?
I think that's absolutely the case, and I think that we really do have a lot of power. And if people can become aware that they need to eat organic and they're going to demand it, start demanding it at the restaurants, get the restaurants to understand, at least if you offer one organic choice, you might really, it wouldn't hurt the restaurant so much to have just that one thing on the menu that's organic.
Yeah.
For those people who are trying to eat organic and they start seeing that all of them are ordering that, they'll start to see there's a market, right?
Absolutely.
They could start small. They could start small with just one organic choice. And because they often have like the sort of low fat choice or the high carb, you know what I mean? The low carb choice. In the U.S., people have those kinds of specialized items on the menu.
Yeah.
It's not easy. It's not hard to imagine the organic choice, which I think would be wonderful,
Me too.
To just say this is organic, yeah.
Yeah. So
the other thing I want to say is that
yep.
there's some excitement about the lawsuits and stuff. I think you know about the California lawsuit against glyphosate on non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. This happened last October or around that last summer.
Mm-hmm.
A guy, he applied Roundup to schoolyards, which is like really horrible. His job was to use Roundup on schoolyards. And he developed non-Hodgkin's lymphoma at an early age, and he was very sick. He was in his 40s. He had young children. It was very tragic. And he was the first case that they brought to trial, and he won the trial big time. It was a jury trial, and they awarded him something like $380 million in damages, which was reduced down to something like $68 million by the judge. But the original jury said $380 million because of punitive damages, because of Monsanto misleading him and misleading us about the toxicity of their product. And now there's another lawsuit going on. There's something like 10,000 other lawsuits in the works, people who are coming forward and saying, I've got non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, I think glyphosate caused it. And so the lawyers are getting really geared up and very busy. And it was just announced that one of the companies that sells Monsanto, and I believe it's a company that sells it to sells glyphosate to golf courses, in particular, had made a decision to stop selling glyphosate, not because they thought it was toxic, but because they couldn't get insurance.
Great.
Very, very interesting.
Yeah, well, that's fantastic news. Because that really is the beginning, hopefully the beginning of the end of the proliferation of glyphosate. And if the blame can be laid at the feet of glyphosate for a lot of these medical and chronic disease conditions, that's excellent news. I know in Europe there are moves to have a glyphosate banned, but we're not there yet. We're moving closer, but it still hasn't arrived, unfortunately. But that's good news.
My impression is that the UK is behind the rest of Europe. France and Germany are more actively involved in curtailing glyphosate. I think particularly France. It's very exciting what's happening in France, and I'm hopeful that if France would do a sort of national level, we're banning this stuff, that would be a huge signal to the rest of us. And there are countries who have banned glyphosate. Sri Lanka banned it for quite a while. They undid the ban because they got so much pressure from the farmers, but Sri Lanka banned it because they have their farmers were dying in record numbers from kidney failure at a young age. In their 40s, they were dying from kidney failure, and they've traced it to glyphosate. There have been papers published that have claimed that glyphosate is playing a major role. It's a complex combination of other toxic chemicals working with glyphosate to cause this kidney failure in these agricultural workers. I've studied that a lot, and I've published papers on that topic. Yeah. Well, it's very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's good news to see it being banned anywhere, and as you said, it's a sort of a spreading of the message, isn't it? Just I'm aware that we're maybe pushing on time, Dr. Seneff. Just maybe one last question before we close is that. I mean, there are some that might say that Monsanto glyphosate is very establishment and all that, and this message of trying to unpick the puzzle of glyphosate's implicit role or its role within all these diseases. I mean, do you come under any pressure with your studies and with your research, or do you find that you have a relatively free rein? That there may be those that would question the ability to speak freely, shall we say?
I know. I mean, many people are held back, and they just don't go there because they'll lose their job, they'll lose their funding. I've been very fortunate. Of course, I'm past retirement age, so I could quit at any time. MIT doesn't get any funding from Monsanto, and it's a very liberal place. They have not tried to stop my research at all. I have a very good funding source, which is a Taiwanese computer company that has been funding my work for many years, and they're very proud of my work and happy to continue it, which is wonderful. So I don't have any issues. I know like UC Davis, for example, has a a large investment from Monsanto and other agrochemical companies. And then there, for example, they've got involvements with the racehorses. You know, the racehorses in California are dying in record numbers on the racetrack from injuries to their legs, which I think is due to glyphosate contaminating their collagen and messing up their joints, just like it's doing for us. And there's no clue it seems that there's no clue among the racehorse owners that glyphosate is causing this problem in their horses. And there's a tremendous effort to hide the fact that glyphosate is, because of this funding from Monsanto, presumably is just really slowing things down. So I think there are many cases where it's obvious to me that these animals are being injured by glyphosate, and there's denial. And there's denial usually because Monsanto is supplying money that's going to make sure that, and of course also the repercussions if you came out against them, lose your funding, maybe even lose your job. I mean, people are really worried. They're very meek, I guess is the word for it. They're afraid to stand up to Monsanto because they're afraid of ruining their career, which is, you know, something to worry about, right? So
indeed, yeah.
It's amazing to me how well Monsanto has been able to control the research that's going on. I think if people could have gotten the adequate funding to do the kinds of studies that are now coming out, like this one I just mentioned about the second generation, the Italians there's actually a big Italian group that's doing some great research recently with good funding from safe sources. So they're really pushing the envelope and getting some interesting results. We're going to hopefully see some amazing papers, I'm hoping, coming out in the future from people who are able to dodge this issue of Monsanto holding them back. You know.
Well, it's wonderful to hear that your research is unobstructed in any way. So that's marvelous, and you know, a personal thank you to you for all of the stuff you're diving into, and you know, on behalf of loads more people, I'm sure this information is really empowering. It helps people to you know, obviously once we're informed, we're able to make informed choices, and we can steer our diet and our lifestyle choices ultimately around these obstacles to our health. So thank you so much from loads of people for your research, Dr. Seneff. It's really, really wonderful. And thank you so much for taking the time to join us here on the show and share the benefits of your wisdom. Wonderful stuff.
It was great. Thank you so much for having me.
Great, and thank you so much for listening. I do urge any of you to listeners that you know, visit the website lawfulrebel.com, where you can find lots of other stories such as this to help us take control of our lives and you know, steer our lives towards thriving instead of towards chronic disease. So thank you very much for listening, and I do hope you'll join me again for another episode of Living Outside the Matrix.